a question for you. Well, let me before I ask this question though say, I've greeted several of you this morning. Haven't had a chance to greet all of you, but I want to say that this is a season that is called Christmas Tide, and I feel like I don't necessarily have to say that because we are the church, but also I know sometimes we're new enough to our faith journey sometimes that we may not know that, and I know definitely the world, the culture would like to tell us that Christmas is over. You know, that after Christmas Day, it's all done. Now it's time to pack up the ornaments. And somebody, when we were coming into church this morning, saw the Christmas trees and said they're so glad that they're still up because they're beautiful. And they are. And in fact, they're here on purpose. And they'll actually even be here next Sunday, the 5th of January. Why? Because we're still in Christmas Tide next Sunday. Christmas Tide is from Christmas Day through what's called Epiphany, which will happen actually on January the 6th. You know the song we sing at Christmas, the 12 days of Christmas? Well, that is about these days. It's not about the 12 days that lead up to Christmas. It's about Christmas Day, which is, the first day, and then it goes all the way through those 12 days, and it ends on the Epiphany. And Epiphany, as you'll hear us say again later, is when we celebrate that the wise men, the Magi, came and visited Jesus. And in fact, it's a likely, I shouldn't say fact, but it's likely that the Magi visited the baby Jesus not on the night of his birth, or even close to that. It was likely as much as 2 years later. Potentially, but probably a few months at least after, because he was no longer in the stables, but had now moved from the stables into a house somewhere and was visited by those wise men. And so on Epiphany, we celebrate the wise men coming and offering gifts. And so Rafa, who's a student from Spain, who's staying with us for another 4 days, he's been with us since August as an exchange student. He told us that they in Spain really don't celebrate Christmas in the significant ways that we do. It's actually on the Three Kings Day that they celebrate, which is Epiphany. They have big celebrations. They exchange gifts on Three Kings Day, and they give the gifts because the Magi brought the gifts. And so I thought, oh, that's interesting. So maybe I'll go to Spain and then have Christmas again. Woohoo! Actually, he's staying here until the end of the school year, but with a different family. So I just wanted to share that with you as a bit of information. So it is completely appropriate. And so if you hear me say so, and I will if I see you, I'll wish you a Merry Christmas or a Merry Christmas Tide, which means we are in the season of Christmas. So keep celebrating Christmas. And kids, keep asking your parents for another gift each day. No, I'm just kidding. Sienna. Well, yeah, that sounds all right to you, doesn't it, Sienna? Woohoo, 12 presents. All right. That being said, let me ask you this question. What is energy? And I ask that question because I've done some research, and it's been fascinating, this journey that I've been on actually for the last couple of weeks. So, energy can mean various things. Mostly, it is used in science to describe how much potential a physical system has to change. In physics, energy is property of matter and space, objects, and fields. It can be transferred between objects and can also be converted in form. It cannot, however, this is what I found really fascinating, be created or destroyed. Just think about that for a second. Richard P. Feynman, a theoretical physicist and recipient of the Nobel Prize in physics, wrote this. He said, "There is a fact, or if you wish, a law governing all natural phenomena that are known to date. There is no known exception to this law. It is exact so far as we know." And he said, "The law is called the conservation of energy. It states that there is a certain quantity which we call, quote unquote, energy, that does not change in the manifold changes that nature undergoes." Now that is complex, right? I'm going to unpack this a little bit. And no, this is not a physics class. It is a sermon for our faith journey. But I need to set the context, so stay with me if you will. This is a very abstract idea. because it is a mathematical principle. It says that there is a numerical quantity which does not change when something happens. In other words, as Feynman goes on and says, he says that there are things changing all the time in our culture, in our environment, in our lives, in our physical space, in nature itself. But every time something changes, all it does is exchanges energy from one thing to another, and that energy becomes something different or manifests itself differently. We don't have a picture clearly, he says, of what energy, what it's like, what it comes from, or even what it is. And that's why I asked you the question, what is energy? As I researched this, and the deeper that I went on it, and I got to tell you, I went pretty deep for a while, I kept finding that it was more challenging the deeper I went to try to get some sense of what energy is. I'm going to have to go take a physics class now. I'm going to have to go have a long conversation with Dave Roberts. Right, Lori? I'm sure he'd love to have that conversation. I was reading the musings of a physicist teacher from the collected writings of teachers from all across the American Association of Physics Teachers on a science website called Think for Yourself. And they had a statement on there that said this: nobody knows what energy actually is. I was stopped by that statement. I'm like, wait a minute, I know what energy is, right? Don't we all? I know what it is. It's when I put a knife in the light socket. It's what shocks me. That's energy. But that's just a manifestation. What physicists say is this: by pretending otherwise, we do not do our students a disservice. Not only are we ignoring the wonder associated with the idea, we are also denying you the opportunity to engage with the concept at any level beyond the superficial. Bottom line is this: nobody gets energy because there's nothing to get. Energy is not tangible. It is an indirectly observed quantity, and we can talk about the ways that we observe it and the way that we can experience it. Like I said, when I stick a knife in a light socket and I feel something, I know what that is. I experience that energy, but what is it? You can't hold it in your hand. You can't weigh it with an electronic balance. You can't see it. You can't touch it. You can't smell it. Yet when the universe was first created, there was a certain amount of this put into the mix. This is what the physicist on the website said. Or rather, there was energy that was in this mix, and add a little dash of time, and it's all still there today. In form, it changes, yes, but the energy itself can never disappear, and it never changes. Isn't that fascinating? And I say that to say this: what if what was created by God, as we read about in here in Genesis chapter 1, what if that itself was what God gave? God gave this energy, this amount of energy that we have. What if that energy is the presence, the spirit, in some ways, of God? Feynman, he went on, the physicist who's a Nobel Prize winner, went on and said this: it is important to realize that in physics today, we have no knowledge of what energy is. He was recognizing that although we have expressions for various forms of energy, kinetic, heat, electrical, light, sound, etc., we seem to have no idea, he said, of what the all-encompassing notion of energy is. So I want to take us back to this statement: the wonder associated with the idea of energy. Wonder. What is wonder? Well, that's a little easier. Wonder is, as defined in the dictionary, a feeling of surprise mingled with admiration caused by something beautiful, unexpected, unfamiliar, and inexplicable. To have wonder about energy. But what also if we have wonder about other things? I'm just using energy as one little example. Albert Einstein, in an interview for the Saturday Evening Post in 1929, said, "I am enough of an artist to draw freely upon my imagination. Imagination is more important than knowledge." That science is an art is a stimulating idea to me as well. That science is an art, as Einstein describes it. In his 1931 book, Cosmic Religion and Other Opinions and Aphorisms, Einstein expanded on this very thought, and he said this: imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. It is, strictly speaking, a real factor in scientific research. Imagination. I love to hike. That's why I brought my backpack today. And I have a question for you, another question. What's the first thing you do when you prepare for a hike or any journey at all? What's the first thing you do when you're going to plan a trip? Any thoughts? Say again? Pick a date. Okay, set a date. Yeah, that's an important thing. You got to decide when you're going to go. You got to decide where you're going to go. You got to decide what you're going to need. So, like in my backpack, whenever I go hiking, I have all kinds of stuff in here. I have my water bottles. I have a whistle in here in case I get into trouble. I also have my compass. And I use my compass to kind of help me see where I'm going. I've got a first aid kit. I've got a knife in case I need it there's all kinds of things I plan, right? But I got to thinking about this idea. And I read a lot about this science and stuff, and I thought, wait a minute. What if the first thing that we need whenever we're going to take any kind of trip at all is to have imagination? We have to conjure the idea of what it is that we want to do, where it is we want to go. For example, I'm now beginning a plan, and Becky's not real excited about this yet, but she'll hopefully get there. I am going to take a spiritual pilgrimage and hike what's called the Camino del Santiago. It starts in southern France, drops into Spain, and goes all the way across the northern part of Spain to St. James Cathedral in Santiago. It's a journey of about 900 plus kilometers, and it takes about a month to hike. And so I'm planning that a couple of years from now. And as I've begun to think about this, I'm reading a book that I got, and I'm doing some research online, and I'm reading other people who've taken the journey, their blogs. But the first thing I realized I had to do was to get this idea about what I wanted to do, to have imagination. And I love that is what Einstein, I think, is getting at here. And he says imagination is more important even than knowledge. Knowledge is, yes, key. I have knowledge now of what I want to do, and that'll help me put what I need in my backpack, and I'll be able to plan my flights and plan for where I'm going to stay and know how much money I need, and there's a lot of knowledge that I gain for that. But until I get excited about doing it in the first place, I'm not going to do anything until I have this spark of excitement, of imagination for what I might want to do. So on this last Sunday of 2019, this last Sunday of the second decade of the 2000s, I want to take us back to the beginning in Genesis chapter 1 and look at what it is that we are reading here. In the beginning, when God created, in the beginning, that word creation is a Hebrew word called bara. And bara is create. John Lennox, he is the Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford and the Emeritus Fellowship in Mathematics and Philosophy of Science at Green Templeton College in Oxford University. He's a philosopher of science and a Christian apologist. And he notes that this Hebrew word for creates, bara, is only used with God as the subject every single time. And so I went and grabbed my Strong's concordance of the Bible and looked through, and sure enough, it's number 1254 if you want to go look it up in your Strong's concordance. And every single place where that word is used for create, God is the subject. And so this word is unique to God. It's different, but it's the same for you and me when we create. We are created in the image of God, and we are created with the intellect and the capacity to imagine and create as God does, as God did in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, when God created, when God thought, that's what I want to suggest here this morning. When God had the imagination to conjure you and me. God created in God's own thinking who you and I are, and then God made us. I think it's a wonderful idea for me to know that first I was thought of by God, and so were you. And then as God thought of us, that the joy that brought to God, then God created us. Because later we read, as God creates, God goes on and then creates physically these things. God is the one who created. Lennox goes on in his lecture at the Society of Socrates in New York, a lecture that he gave entitled 7 Days That Divide the World. And he gave a lecture about these creation stories. And he said, never be ashamed to say, I don't know. I want to say what the Bible says and not be ashamed of it. But I don't try to defend it by going beyond it. I don't want to say less than what it says, but I don't want to say more than what it says. And the more I study the text, the more I am fascinated by its complexity and at the same time, its simplicity. I pause here because I want us to, and maybe the last Sunday of the year, the Sunday after Christmas, our brains and bodies are too tired to think about this. But I got to tell you, when I was thinking about this and reading this week, I was excited about this. And I was like, this is fascinating. Because this reminds me that God is always creating. And here's the problem that I think we struggle with. I think we as Christ followers, especially those of us who've been following Jesus long enough, we get kind of comfortable with what we think we already know about faith. And we forget that in this story, that in the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and God then moved across that God is not done with creation, but that God is always creating, and God begins a creation story for us each and every day. God is creating something new in you, even now as we sit here this morning. Are we aware of it? Do we have the imagination to know that? Isaiah 55 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, declares the Lord." This is God speaking to us. God goes on and says this, "As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts greater than your thoughts." So I want us to draw this conclusion or this comparison to the analogy that I was giving to us. When I asked, what is energy? Let me also ask you, what is faith? And I think sometimes we try to simplify it. We try to put our hands on it and hold it in a way that is more complex and more mesmerizing and more wonder-filled and more imagination-creating in us if we would let it. But instead, we want to simplify it, or we want to grab hold of it like scientists try to grab hold of energy with their ideas and with their words. But I love that the physicists are willing and able to say, we don't really know what it is. What would it be for us as Christians to ultimately, at the end of the day, like Lennox says, to be willing to stand up and say, I don't really know what faith is. I can tell you what faith feels like. I can demonstrate to you what faith looks like. But what is it is something that I think is beyond our capacity to grab hold of and to hold on to. Why? Because God's ways are higher and deeper than ours. So who are we? Yes, God created us a little bit lower than the angels or the God. But just because we have a lot of who God is doesn't mean that we have all of what God is within us. We have the capacity to know it, to contain it. Isaiah 29:14 goes on and says this, "Therefore, behold, I will proceed to do a marvelous work among this people, even a marvelous work and a wonder. For the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the understanding of their prudent men shall be hid." How can we assume to understand and know God in fullness? We can't any more than physicists can understand energy. But we can put language and practice to faith and to love and to hope and know peace. And we can do it in these ways. And this is where I want to finish. God calls us at the threshold of this brand new year to prepare for our journey. It's a new journey for us to grab our backpack, put it on, and load it up with those things that we're going to need. And so here's what I want to challenge you to do and encourage you to do is take one step. You've heard the old adage, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with what? That's right, one step. So the one step that we take in the new year, maybe it's to decide in the new year you're going to pray a little bit more than you do now. Or pray if you don't practice prayer on a regular basis each day. Go to God's word with imagination and wonder. Go to the scriptures. And don't just read the scriptures like you always have, like you've grown accustomed to it. Approach God's word maybe with imagination, with new questions, pondering what is it that God is trying to say to you. Befriend silence. Like the Psalm says, Psalm 20 or 14, be still and know that I am God. Maybe decide in the new year, one new thing you're going to do is every day find some time to sit silently with God. Or maybe normalize contentment or normalize boredom and be okay with not feeling like you have to do something all the time. Be content. As Paul writes of it, I have learned the secret to contentment. What is it? To trust God. Maybe this new year, one thing you can do is embrace the truth that prayer is not something that we learn how to master, but it is an art form of putting ourselves before God and letting God speak to us. Maybe prayer doesn't have to be us talking so much and listening more. Or lastly, maybe it's us just simply trusting that God is always doing something new. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was a formless void, dark, and the darkness covered the face. And then there was a wind from God that swept over the face of those waters. The word that's there that's interpreted a wind of God is actually ruach. It means literally breath. Like when it talks every other place about that, it uses that word, ruach, the breath of God. God breathing over us. So I want to close with prayer. And